Hey everybody, this is Scott again. I thought I would do another hopefully quick tutorial for Ember and Ember-CLI. This one specifically kind of going over helpers, what they do for us, and probably touch on utils as well, kind of a similar thing that we can do. Really just a way for us to kind of extract some functions that we want to use throughout our application. And helpers are great because they're actually things that we can use in our template. And one of the things you'll see if you go to the actual Ember website and read through the tutorials, one of the ones that they pick out is formatting currency. It's a really good example, something that you don't necessarily want to write a ton of computed properties and all this stuff to inject that into your template. So something like a helper really makes sense, and you'll find helpers traditionally are a little more simple than things like computed properties or services or stuff like that. So let's go through and kind of create some examples of that. So as usual, the version of Ember I'm currently using is 2.4.2. So again, if you're using a later version, some of this stuff might have changed. So to get started, kind of skip some of the beginning steps, I actually already created an Ember application I'm just going to run here. And if you actually want to play around with this, it's right on my GitHub profile, sbatson5. It's called user test application. So go ahead and feel free to fork it, git clone. If you don't use Git, you can actually just download it as a zip file. I'll link this in the description. And what I did here is I just went ahead and I used Express to kind of mock a backend server. So what I have is I have some books. You can go to the books route specifically by ID to find a particular book. You can look at many books. I also have a users route too. Here's multiple users, and this is what I'm going to be focusing on here. And if you're really curious on how I have mocked this server, pull up the repository and look at the server folder. And you can I left some comments there, so you can kind of go through what this is doing. But essentially, all we're doing is hosting an API. So if I go to localhost/API/books, here's an example of my books. Go to users. So this is all my users. So just imagine this is an actual API. So this none of our changes will persist, obviously, kind of like a read-only thing. So if you go to look at the actual users route, I iterate over all of the users here. So let's bring this up in our application. So we go to our users route. This is the index route. In the actual route itself, return all of the users. Then in my controller, I set the model to be called users just so it's more readable in my template. In here, I go over every single user. So for each users as user, right, show their first name, their last name, their email, and their date of birth. Then I also show the index. So when you do each loops, if you actually want something to actually count, you can actually do the index, and you'll see here that's why we get user number 0, user number 1, user number 2, because we're iterating over an array. We index starting at 0. So that's actually a great first example of a helper. We can create one that literally just adds 1 so that we can better reflect what the index means. So let me open a new tab here. In Ember, generate helper. We'll call it like index counter. And Ember will generate that for us. So unlike components, helpers do not need to have a dash in their name. Components do. That tells the Ember resolver what it's looking for, kind of saves it some time. Helpers don't necessarily need that. And let me cut a new branch. We'll call this video test. That way I don't accidentally push up any saves. So let's open this up. Helpers, what did I call it? Index counter. So look at our little function that we have here. The first thing you'll notice is that the function name at camel cases it, and that's important to remember. So let's delete these optional items here. So what does a helper do? It's going to take in some params, and it always returns something, typically something really basic, something you want rendered in your template. So you wouldn't return like an array or an object. You typically just return a string, right? Because that's what makes sense. Sometimes you could return markup. There's issues with that, certainly. So how do we pass this in and get the number that we want? So all we're going to do is return the number 1, right? So let's assume that we can just do return params plus 1, right? That'd be pretty simple. So we were looking at users, so let's go to our users route. And if you want to use a helper within your template, just like anything else, through HTML bars, double curly braces, and then we call it index dash counter. So here in the template, you have to include the dash, and I'll show you some examples of when we wouldn't include the dash, and then we're going to pass in the index. So let's save that and see what that does. So we got users number 0, and then we added 1 to it. So it concatenated information for us. That's really not what we want. So what do we need to do? We probably need to parse this as a string. So const number equals, let's like parse float params, and then we'll return number plus 1, and let's see what that does. Here we go. Users number 1, user number 2, user number 3. There. Really, really simple helper. Now when we include the index in an each loop in our template, we can correctly show the right number that we want. Really, really simple. Again, helpers do tend to be pretty simplistic. The next one that I'd want to create is to format this date. So we're getting a date object back right from our API. And it's when we put the date into the template, it shows the whole thing. And I just want to show like month / day / year, because that's more readable. So let's generate another template. Generate a helper. We'll call it format date. Cool. So we go here and we have another one called format date. So how do we want to show this? So we have our params here. So let's do const date equals params. So how do we want to break these up? Well, it's probably going to be easiest to break it into day, month, year. So I'm going to separate those out into different variables. So const, we'll say day equals date dot get date, right? So that'll give us the day of the month. Const month equals date dot get month, and get month, much like get day, is going to give us an index. So like the month of May will actually come back as 4, so we want to actually add 1 to that. And then const year equals date dot get full year, which should give us in this case 2016. So now we want to return a string that's concatenated. So one of the really cool things in ES6, if you're not aware of this, is template strings, which is, in a lot of other programming languages, about time it finally came to JavaScript. Normally, if you had a bunch of strings, you'd be like day plus, and then you would put in the slash, and then, right? And that was just kind of messy, and it kind of could mess up arithmetic too. So now you just use the little bang thing, well, I forget what this is called, rather than quotes, and then we can actually, any variable that we want, we do the $ and curly braces, so we can say day slash $ curly braces month slash $ curly braces year. So that's what it's going to return for us. So now in our template here, much like above, we can format date for the user dot date of birth. Date dot get date is not a function. So let's let's just wrap this up just in case. There we go. Cool. So we do the day first, then the month and the year. Of course, I'm in America and we do things backwards, so let's do month, then day, then year. Cool. So July 30th, 1986, January 12th, 1975, February 22nd, 1991. And because I wrote these mocks, I know that those are actually correct. So I'm going to just double check them real quick. If we go to our user JSON. Okay, cool. So those are the right dates. We're now formatting the date correctly. Awesome. So again, really, really simple. They typically take a couple of inputs and they spit out a couple of outputs. Really, really handy tools for, you know, when we're messing around with things in the template. You wouldn't really extract a ton of complicated logic to helpers. Again, if you're going to do that, most likely you're doing something wrong. You really want to pass them something simple and get something simple back. So now let's go to our books route here. Whoops. And sometimes this API mock crashes on me. I don't know if it's a deal with Express, but if you're using this example and that happens, just restart the server, and I think that typically fixes it. Cool. All right, so here are all my books, and we can use the same exact thing we were doing before. So we want to do the index counter here. Switch back. Cool. Book number 1, book number 2, book number 3. So what I want to focus on here, and this is the example that you'll find on the Ember.js website, is the price. So a lot of times databases will give you price numbers as integers. The reason behind that is because most databases have either integers or floats, and you don't usually want to apply floating point math to currency because it only does 2 decimal places, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of reasons behind it. So that's kind of the example I mocked up here, and that's also the example you'll find on the Ember.js website. So let's do a format currency helper. So Ember generate helper format currency. Cool. So we have this generated, and you'll notice it generates some unit tests for us too automatically. Always good to test your stuff. So here, let's delete this hash. I'll go over what that hash is in just a second. So what do we want to do? Because again, we're getting an integer back. So const, I'll say value equals our params divided by 100, right? Because again, we're getting an integer back, and we want to move the decimal places over 2. So we're going to divide it by 100. So we can return value dot to fixed 2 decimal places. So if we come back to our books route where we are showing the price here, this is when we can put in our new helper, format currency. Let's switch, let me pull this out so I don't have to keep doing that. Cool. So 12.00, 15.50. I want the $ in there, so the easiest solution to that would be to again do a template string $. We actually want the $ in the string, so it looks like I'm adding 2, but again, it's $ curly braces is how we tell the string to evaluate this as some sort of parameter. So now we get the currency sign in. Cool. So what if you want to do the same sort of formatting, but you want it to sort of be agnostic of the type of currency? So maybe we pass in a $, maybe we pass in euros, francs, yen, you know, lots of different currency out there. That's when you get into named arguments. So if we look at this template, you know, what am I passing to this function, right? Because it's really all it is just a function. I'm passing one thing, which is book.price. But now I want to pass in something else. I want to pass in a currency, you could just, kind of slap it on like another string here, and that will add it to the params. So the params that come to our helpers is actually an array. So if I put in a bunch of things in this template, if I did, book price, book discount, right, and then I took a discount into consideration, that would all be part of params, and I would have to extract those items out of the params array. But the other thing that it does for you is, and you saw me delete it when we first generated these helpers, is you can pass in a hash of named arguments. So let's pass in a sign, and that is our currency. So in here, we now have our params, but then we have our named arguments. And we want to extract our sign from that. So const sign equals named arguments, but because this is a hash, again, we can use that ES6 destructuring, right, to say, look at this hash and find the thing that's called sign. And then similarly here, we can pipe the sign in. So let's hope I did that right. Cool. So now we have the sign in. Let me look up another symbol here because I don't know the keyboard shortcuts. So the one for euro, just to show you that it does change. Cool. So now we can choose what sign we want to pass in. Maybe you write in some logic that says, named argument equals the named arguments, or a dollar sign, right? So we're gonna default to a dollar sign if nothing is passed in, and this should work if I give you nothing. Nope, I get undefined. So you would want to do some if-else logic, but so those are the two things that get passed to helpers. So another really cool thing to remember is that, again, this is just a JavaScript function. The Ember resolver does a lot of stuff for us that makes the helper class available in the template, but you can actually access these functions within routes and controllers, computed properties, components, etc. Because again, it's just a JavaScript function. We're exporting it, so we can actually import this in. But the important thing to remember is, again, params, it expects it to be an array. So what's getting passed to it from a JavaScript file is going to be different than what's being passed to it from a template file. So it's just one of those caveats you want to remember. So one of the other really, really cool things, and it's sort of out of the scope of this video, but one of the really important things to remember is that you can't have class-based helpers. So again, by default, helpers are stateless, right? Because it's just a simple function. It takes something in and it returns something. Typically, it returns a string. However, if you want your helper to be aware of the state of your application, you would want to make it a class-based helper. So here, all we do is we create a function, right? So we're going to export this function, and then we call the Ember helper class's helper method with this function, and that's what makes it accessible in our template. Here, in this example, they actually extend the helper class, so it's a little different, and when you do that, you have to call the compute method. And again, it's kind of out of the scope here, but it is something to remember. And a really good example of something that watches state is a shopping cart. So state being, something that doesn't change no matter where I am in my application, whether I go to, to a products page, whether I'm reading reviews, whatever. I expect my shopping cart to always be the same. If I add an item to it, I expect that item to always be in my shopping cart, right? It's stateful. That's what services are great for. And if we want to write a helper that maybe like totals all the items in our cart, that's when you would create this type of class-based helper. So that's kind of what it does for you, if that makes sense. So the output again is supposed to be the same. You're still just exporting a string, but because we want it to be aware of other things that are happening in our application, we need to make it a class-based helper so that we can therefore access other things that Ember gives us, like injecting a service like our shopping cart. So kind of keep that in mind. So another kind of similar thing to helpers that you can use in your application are utils. So utils aren't something that's rendered in the template, but again, it's one of those, I want to take some sort of functionality, some function that I'm going to use all over the place, and just extract it out to a file and then access it, wherever, whether it's in a route, a template, a controller. So let's go over a real quick example of that. So I'm going to actually generate a controller for the books/index route. So we're going to throw a controller in there. And now what I want to do is I want to make a util for applying a discount. So let's Ember generate util. We'll call it get discount. Cool. So utils get discount. So get discounts the method that it creates. Again, much like helpers, it's a dasherized file name, which is a camel-cased function, and this takes in whatever we want it to be, because again we're just writing a function here. So let's take in a value and take in a discount, and I expect the discount to be written as like 20 if I want 20%. So let's say discount will equal discount divided by 100, because I want them to multiply the value by that. So now we're going to return value times 1 minus the discount. So if I get a 20% discount, the value I'm going to get back should be 80% of what the total was. So really, really simple example here of using a util. All right, so now that we have our util created, how do we actually apply this to something on our controller? And I actually created the controller in the wrong spot. I want to create it on the show route. Ember generate controller books show. Let's refresh this. You'll see my console's probably blowing up. So again, if this Express server crashes, just restart Ember. It's a bit fickle, but for the most part it works. Cool. So now we're looking at one particular one. So the idea here being, you can see the price for all the books, but when you click on an actual book, maybe you want to see the discounted price. And again, this could be a helper, because we're ultimately going to show something that's on the template, but just kind of extract some of this, just to know that if you want to ever move a function out, or if you have a function that you're using in a lot of places, you can put it in a util. So how do we get this method into something like a controller or a route or a component? That's when we use the import method. Import get discount from, and we want to go to the utils folder, utils, and get dash.discount, because again we're matching the file name, not the method name here, but the method is exported as camel case get discount. So if we go and look at the template here, again we're just showing information about a particular book. It looks like my little server crashed here. So again, if you're running the server locally and you get a bunch of error messages, just restart Ember and Express should update. Cool. So we still want to format the currency, the book price. Cool. So now we have undefined sign equals, again, the $sign. Oops. You probably noticed Ember was yelling at me there. Cool. So now we actually want to apply the discount to this. So again, I want to express the discount as a percentage. Just call it 20. And since we are importing Ember, I want to import a few methods from Ember specifically. So again, let's use that ES6 destructuring. So we're already using the controller, so let's import that. We want to import computed properties and the get method. So we can now delete this. We can just call controller directly instead of ember.controller. So I want to create a computed property. So computed properties, I can go over in a lot more detail because they are pretty complicated, but to keep it really simplistic, computer properties are properties that will update based on the things that they observe. So we want to observe book.price, and we want to observe the discount. So anytime the discount updates or the price of the book updates, this computed property will update for us. And then it's going to be a function, and we're going to return something, right? So the first thing we want to do is get the discount. So const discount equals get this discount, right? Because this method's not going to have access to something else within our controller. So we have to get it here so we have access to it, and get we'll call price equals get this book.price. Cool. So now we can actually call this method and pass in the price and the discount. For some reason it was missing my parentheses. So now we have the discounted price, so let's throw that into our template. Rather than the book price, we can throw in the discounted price. It looks like my server crashed on me again. So let's just restart Ember. Great, so now we have the discounted price. So again, this could have been a helper very easily, but just to show you, kind of what utils do, kind of a similar thing to helpers in that it's a simple function, gives us back something. Utils can be way more complicated too. They can do really, anything a function can do. So again, if you want to just extract logic out, they're really great, especially if you have something that's like really, really complicated. I've worked on things for financial planning that taking a ton of variables that normally you'd think it would live within a component or a controller, but just to make the code more readable, we extract it to a util. Sometimes I also extract JSON or arrays or something to a util. It doesn't have to even be a function. It could just return like a JSON mock, or like a list of tooltips. I've done that before too. So again, it's just about kind of where you want to move things to kind of make your app more readable and more accessible. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Again, helpers take in parameters as well as named arguments. They return a string, something that you want to be rendered in your template. Much like utils, you can import these functions into other JavaScript files. Just remember that params expects it to be an array. So if you're going to use it in your JavaScript, pass the parameters into the function itself as an array. Utils can't be rendered in our template because they're just JavaScript functions. Get rid of that console log here. But they can be, it's just a great way of extracting logic out. So let me know if you had any questions on that. Hopefully I kept this one somewhat shorter, a little more simplistic than some of my other videos. And again, if you want to play around with this, just go to my GitHub page. Feel free to clone that repo. Again, it's really simple. It just has a couple models of users and books. Feel free to play around with that. Thanks.